Hi, welcome to another segment of California CEO's Nonprofit Showcase presented by the ARC of Riverside County. I'm Robbie Silver, Director of Communications of the ARC, and this is one in a series of videos to introduce you to special friends and advocates who have worked with our agency to improve the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in California and beyond. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nora J Baladerian, the Executive Director of the Disability and Abuse Project based in Los Angeles. Dr. Nora is a national recognized advocate for abuse victims with disabilities. She is a licensed psychologist, and her practice includes both clinical and forensic work. She has worked with abuse and crime victims with disabilities since 1972, advocating for equal justice. She has convened 10 national conferences on abuse, authored over 50 articles, 6 books, and is the executive producer of 2 training videos funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime, including one for first responders. She has recently released a book for parents that she identifies as a blueprint to reduce risk and impact of abuse. She works with both crime victims as well as other offenders with disabilities. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nora. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
So as we know, you are one of the national pioneers of this and in the area of treatment of abuse. How did you begin your work, and how did you basically begin this whole process?
It started really when I began working for the regional centers, which was begun legislatively in 1979, but regional centers began in the early 70s. And so I was one of the first employees at a local regional center in Los Angeles. And that's where I learned about people with developmental disabilities. Prior to that, I really hadn't had exposure that I was aware of people with developmental disabilities, and we received a great deal of training from USC, UCLA, and experts that would fly in to teach us, and we met people with developmental disabilities, and I kind of fell in love with them. Prior to that, I had been doing work in rape crisis centers, and also in the area of human sexuality. I was a certified sex educator. And later, so I worked for regional centers for a while, and I found that they really didn't look at issues of sexuality as an integral part of who we are as human beings. And frankly, that's a fight that I'm continuing to fight, to have recognition of this important part of our lives. But after I left working for Regional Center as an employee, I became what's called a vendor here in the state of California, and that's an authorized provider of services. While working with one of my clients, she told me that she was an incest victim. Her father sexually used her and her sister, who also had developmental disabilities. And that was my first exposure through her that sexual abuse happens to people with developmental disabilities. And it was sort of an aha moment, saying, well, abuse happens to everybody else. Why wouldn't it happen with people who are even more vulnerable than the generic population? Sure. So that completely shifted my focus away from sexuality work and education and treatment into looking at abuse. And part of it was because I'd already formed a California committee on sexuality and sex education, so I felt like, well, that's kind of taken care of in a way. But I couldn't find anybody who was working on abuse issues in the state of California. And actually, it took me quite a while to find anyone who was doing work related to the sexual and physical abuse of people with developmental disabilities.
In a general sense, how would you describe your audience?
Well, first of all, the work with this particular client had to do initially with calling the police and getting some response from that. And then I realized after that that police are really not trained and equipped to work with individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities, with communication disabilities. So that was one problem area. But then what I saw was basically from A to Z in terms of abuse, very little was being attended to. So I needed to talk to individuals with disabilities about when they came in for treatment, about healing from the abuse. But then the next thing came along, I'm not going to give you this in the order of which I did it, but was statistics were starting to show that people with developmental disabilities are abused at much higher rates than those without developmental disabilities. But already in my practice, I was seeing quite a few people with developmental disabilities whose parents were completely blindsided. No one had ever told them that their children are more likely, rather than less likely, to become victims of abuse. So I needed to support the parents in terms of education and what they might be able to do to reduce the risk of abuse happening in the first place. Then in terms of providing therapy, I looked around also for, okay, what are the approved therapies or the effective therapies for crime victims who have cognitive and communication disabilities? And there really aren't any, or weren't any at that time. They're starting to develop some. And so I had to kind of go in that area. So it's this global approach to the problem, not only within the individual of being a trauma victim and how to respond to that and how to improve their life thereafter, but the parents and the others who surround them, their support providers, in giving protection, but also knowing how to respond when it happens and how to change their behavior and approaches when they know that their loved one or their client is a victim of abuse. And then going further out, I found that work with law enforcement, including patrol, first responders, prosecutors, judges, was important too, because like the rest of the community, they did not receive specific training in how to effectively carry out their work with people with cognitive and communication disabilities. So it became this global approach, yet each piece of the pie needed specific attention. So actually the very first thing that happened was the Los Angeles Commission on Assaults Against Women, called LACAW then, now it's called Peace Over Violence, asked if I would basically translate a guidebook that they had for survivors of sexual assault into a format that could easily be understood by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I did that. It's called Survivor, and I wrote it first, and then I realized, oh, I have to put it in even lower language for people who don't read with very many words, and then a separate guide for parents and caregivers. And I like to vet my things, and so we hired 12 individuals with developmental disabilities to read through this to see if it was understandable. And from that, about 4 people revealed more abuses than they had ever done before. So that was one of the first things. And then there's a kind of flip side to this, and that is that individuals with developmental disabilities, when they get older, into their later teens and young adulthood, are more often identified as criminals and committing sex crimes than their age peers that don't have developmental disabilities. So they're identified more often, and I think this may be a function of myths and stereotypes that people continue to believe in, that people with developmental disabilities are oversexed, or they're sexual marauders, or they're dangerous, and all of these myths need to be dispelled on the part of the people holding the myths. But on the part of the individual with a disability, they are not taught what are the laws and the social rules around sex. So even though they may receive sex education, which at this point has, not to my knowledge, included, these are the social rules and these are the laws, they have no idea that that exists. So if they're arrested, then they go to court, and court says, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So they don't have a chance. So in response to that, I wrote a book called The Rules of Sex, and Jim Stream from the ARC of Riverside County said it should say, tagline, for those who have never been told. So this is what it contains, and this is co-written with a person with developmental disabilities, and he wanted it in Spanish too, so it's in Spanish as well. And this is a guide for parents or caregivers or others to be able to provide information that people need so that their first introduction is not arrest and court, but they know what are the rules and what are the laws so that they don't get in trouble with the law. I asked Jim to help me in 1999, I think it was, when at the Disability and Abuse Project we received a grant to continue work that I had already started with the California think tank on abuse and people with disabilities, collecting information and data on what is the status of abuse of children and adults with disabilities, and a number of other activities. So I received a grant, and as an individual, I can't really do much about that, right? So I thought, there was somebody who said to me, if I can ever be of service to you, give me a call. And I remembered, that was Jim Stream. So I called him up and I said, this is what you said. And he's like, did I really say that to you? Yes, you really did. And so he accepted the grant. It was a first grant from the Office of Criminal Justice Planning in California. And from there, we continued to work together for many years, including with the Office for Victims of Crime, developing a DVD, and then this is the DVD for how to do the forensic interview for patrol and for other first responders to crime report. And then we did a second one for first responders in particular, paramedics, firefighters, and others who respond to reports of suspected abuse or crimes against people with developmental disabilities. In the time that I was working with Jim, he also assisted me in producing conferences. I produced the first conference on abuse of people with disabilities, developmental disabilities, in 1986. And then when I got on board with Jim through this grant, we continued to seek and receive grants, and then they were the national conferences by ARC of Riverside County, and those were very successful. And he was amazingly instrumental in getting legislators from nearby and from the state of California to participate, and we had ever-increasing audiences for the conferences, and we continued those until funding was no longer offered to us to do that. But that was another project that was really important. And then the essence, I think, in looking at abuse and people with disabilities is seeing what we can do about reducing the risk of abuse in the first place. And so I developed this guidebook, which you reference as a blueprint. This really is a blueprint for parents and other caregivers on how to reduce the risk of abuse for people with developmental disabilities. And it gives a guide that describes abuse in the concept of 3 time periods. There's the period of time when no abuse is happening, and I call that before. And that's when you get to work and design your plan and help instruct and inform the individual with a developmental disability according to their skills and abilities, that abuse can happen, what it is, and what you should know about it before abuse happens. In learning about what you should know, you also in the before section should have some instruction on what do you do during an abuse, should an abuse happen. Most people can't get out of an abuse. So we had to design a program for them of what a person with or without a disability can do during an abuse that you cannot escape, and most people cannot escape. And then what do you do after? And there's a lot of power in after, because that's when you call the police. And that's when you produce evidence, and there's some do's and don'ts there, and that's where you get therapy. So they're all linked together, the before, during, and the after. They're outlined in the book. Any parent can design the book. And it's like parents often say to me, I don't want to talk about abuse, it's too awful, I just hate the idea, it scares me. And others say the same thing, but adding, but I better learn about it because I want to protect my child. And so those are the people who come forward and want a copy of the book or want to attend a lecture and learn about what is their role before and after. Obviously, they're not there during, or else during wouldn't happen. But what should they know and what should they practice so that when the time comes, like we do with earthquakes or floods or other emergencies that may happen, we prepare earthquake kits because we say we don't want it to happen, but we know that it might. So that we know beforehand what to do during an earthquake or abuse, and we know what to do after. What are the steps? So you don't have to make them up on the spot. So in my experience, working with children and adults with disabilities and their families, this has been a very useful and effective method with an outcome I did not expect. The outcome I did not expect was that the clients who I had had who had been prior victims of abuse, and we did the before, during, and after plan, when they re-experienced another abuse, they did not feel as impacted or traumatized by the abuse. In fact, they said, "I'm so proud of myself. I did all the things anybody could do, and I don't need therapy." Because I know it wasn't about me, it was about being handy to whatever perpetrator it was. And I knew what to do. And my mother knew what to do, or father, or whoever was there. And we went through all the steps. And so they come out with a different emotional response. So the other thing that I think you were asking, what have we done together? And that was that Jim was very instrumental in having me and Tom Coleman, our legal director, design a survey, a national survey. Why did we do this? Well, in the United States, there's only been 2 federally funded studies on child abuse, so abuse of children with disabilities. What they found was that children with disabilities at the highest rate are abused at about 3.5 times the rate of generic children. But there haven't been such studies on adults. So we decided to do one, and what's called the 2012 National Survey on Abuse and Disability. And we had, I think it's 7,589 respondents. Yes. Jim was happy at 1,000 and took us to dinner, and that was great. And I liked the dinner very much, but I thought there's got to be more. And so I was in charge of, Jim and I were in charge of asking the designing the questions. I was in charge of dissemination, and we had identified someone to help us write up the results. So when we got to 7,589, it's like, enough, okay, that's good. And we called the person who was going to interpret the results, who at that point had a family emergency and couldn't do it. So Tom Coleman, who's an attorney, but he's also an avid researcher, stepped up to the plate and said, "I'll do the first report." So the first report was done by Tom Coleman, and Jim and I were, there assisting. But he was the principal author on this, and we found pretty startling results in terms of the incidents and the kinds of abuse, and whether or not there was police involvement, whether or not there was reporting. I think it's about half, just over half never reported. And so the other half did report, but we had a subsequent question in there, which was, what did happen when you reported? And the half that reported said nothing happened. To the more than half that said, I didn't report, and answered the questions, why didn't you? They said, we didn't think anything would happen. So that was validated by the people who did report. So it was really just illuminating the fact that that access to justice as crime victims is failing pretty much across the country. So those are some of the things. I hope that was what you were asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And describe some of your work, particularly for women with disabilities, that you've done.
I have worked with many rape victims. Previous to doing this as a psychologist and as a marriage family counselor. And what is known now about how to provide treatment is much different than it was in the 70s when I was doing it then. I still see rape trauma victims from time to time who don't have developmental disabilities, but the major focus is on folks with developmental disabilities now. And most of that work is covered through the Victims of Crime program that makes therapy free to any crime victim, which is pretty exciting, and it makes ongoing therapy for people a real possibility. So I've learned a lot over the years, and a lot has been learned that I've learned from experts in trauma work on how to work with rape victims, both male and female. I want to tell you that it's about half and half male-female in terms of sexual assault victimization, anyway, in the world of people with developmental disabilities. And I think that is something that's probably less recognized than it should be.
So with all that being said, what do you see happening in the future, particularly with these issues?
Oh, well, I'm ever hopeful that people, parents, caregivers, and in particular administrators will embrace some of the work that I've produced for them and make it a part of everyday life for folks with developmental disabilities. For example, the before, during, and after plan for violence or crime victimization prevention or risk reduction, better said. I call it an individual response plan, so that individually we know, using our own skills and abilities, we know what we can do and what's available for us to do. I would like to have every person with a developmental disability across the country have an individual response plan designed for them, with them, and practiced every month so that those skills will be available at a moment's notice. I would like police officers to have initial in-depth training and then regular ongoing annual training and consultation available to them for responding on site and for learning effective interviewing skills to use with people with cognitive and communication disabilities. And then up the line, I would like the detectives and the investigators to also have access to that information, as well as the prosecutors who need that information, how to question a victim, and also the judges. So I would like to see vertical prosecution units in every state, in every county, wherever there's a court. I would like to see vertical prosecution units so that those who are in those positions are skilled and trained in those things. I would like to see the rules of sex be available to everyone across the nation. Now, the one that we wrote has to do with California, but it's very easy just to add in the laws related to one's own state. So I want everything. I want people with developmental disabilities to know about sexuality and to be able to exercise their sexual rights and social rights. I would like for parents to be aware of abuse and to take the necessary steps to reduce the rate of abuse so that they are not as impacted as well when they're confronted with a reality that they didn't want. Now, what happens currently is that often children are abused in places where the parents don't go. So to school, they don't go to the school. Maybe they go and volunteer sometimes, but they're not there all the time.
Sure.
And I work as an expert witness in legal cases around the country, and what I found is that parents start noticing differences in their kid, refusal or resistance to going to X program. If it's a day program, fine, or if it's school or any particular location, normally it's school. But in addition to that, they have personality changes where they were happy-go-lucky and all was well. Now they're angry and they're irritable and they don't want to go to sleep and they might be aggressive. They may start saying, if they're verbal, they might start saying things that they've heard at school, and the parents are like, where did they hear that? And it's a constellation, basically, of child abuse signs. So they take their children to a physician. This is pretty universal, and the physician, I think, doesn't have abuse in their mind when they're seeing a child with a developmental disability. They're thinking in terms of the developmental disability and trying to figure out why this list of symptoms has emerged. But they don't seem to connect abuse, which is reflective of this list, with a child with a developmental disability. So at the Disability and Abuse Project, we are just now launching what we're calling the Rule Out Abuse campaign, so that physicians and mental health practitioners have on their rule out list, besides, doing blood tests and MRIs or other things, that they can add, check the signs and see if they match the typical list of signs of abuse signs, and if they suspect abuse, then take the appropriate steps to help remove that child from an environment, or to make a suspected child abuse report. Not saying they're determining that it's abuse, but suspected. That's a very likely cause with this constellation of changes. And then also to refer the parents and child to mental health for follow-up, just to provide support during that time. So I want the world to be much safer for people with developmental disabilities, much safer and easier to navigate for the parents and caregivers. And I would like services to be put into place that match the needs and the cognitive and communication skills of children and adults with developmental disabilities.
Thank you, Dr. Nora. That was very enlightening.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's another segment of Nonprofit Showcase. I'm Robbie Silver with the ARC of Riverside County. Thank you for watching.